Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we're looking at Hitman 2 on PC once again, following on from Steve's video covering GPU performance on Sunday. In this video, as was the case with our previous game optimization videos, I'll be covering every graphics setting found in Hitman 2, showing you how each setting stacks up visually, as well as how each setting impacts performance. This should give you guys a good idea of what settings you should be using when playing the game. In terms of graphics settings, there's not really a lot to play with here in Hitman 2. When the game launched, there were just 5 tweakable settings plus the usual sliders for super sampling and resolution. And then with the launch of a patch yesterday, IO Interactive added in a 6th setting for tweaking simulation quality. As Steve showed in his GPU benchmark, the game is pretty well optimized if you're using ultra settings, with cards like the GTX 970 sufficing for 1080p 60fps gameplay. It also looks great, at least in my opinion, when you're playing on these settings, especially in terms of environment density, lighting quality, and some of the reflection effects. At the same time though, the limited selection of graphics options may make it difficult for those with entry-level systems to get the game running well. This is something I'll talk about after we go through all the settings, because a game might be nice and optimized using the ultra settings, but if there's not much room in terms of scaling, there are still going to be gamers that will suffer. In any case, all testing you see in this video was conducted with a range of high-end and mid-range cards from both AMD and Nvidia, so the results you see here should apply to most gamers, though I'll note as we go where performance may differ for those with lower end hardware. Also, I did test using my Core i7 8700K test system overclocked to 4.9 GHz with 16 GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 memory, and this game is reasonably demanding on the CPU, so those with weaker processors may need to turn down a few things. And again, I'll talk about those specific settings. That said, at least for our testing, we were entirely GPU bound. All footage in this video was captured at 4K using a GeForce RTX 2080, so for the best quality, we recommend watching the video using YouTube's 4K settings. Sometimes it's hard to spot the differences if you aren't watching above 1080p on YouTube. We also have provided a source quality download for our Patreons, links to that in the description. Final few notes, all the benchmark data was collected using a single benchmark run, so the footage you see for the visual comparisons doesn't always correspond directly to the performance data. However, I tested using the initial cutscene for the Miami main story mission. This real-time rendered cutscene moves through a lot of locations quickly and highlights most of the game's graphical effects in a short period of time, so it was ideal for this sort of testing. Perhaps the strangest thing about Hitman 2's graphical options is a lack of presets. You simply have the 6 graphics options and it's left up to you to choose which setting you want. That made my job a fair bit easier for this video, but still it might have been nice to include some presets for everyday users that might not be as familiar with settings tweaks. Anyway, we'll start here with the level of detail setting, which controls the quality of models, model draw distance, foliage draw distance, and a number of other related elements. In a lot of scenes, the difference between the 4 modes is subtle. You really need to step into a larger area to see the effects of draw distance changes in action. Throughout most of the levels I tested, there's not a huge difference between ultra and high, especially in indoor areas. With medium, model quality starts to fall away and draw distance for elements like grass moves closer to the camera, while with the low setting, these aspects really fall away and the lack of grass density makes the ground look flat in some areas. When looking at performance, you'll gain about 2% moving from ultra to high, which I think for most users is going to be a good trade-off. It's a small improvement, but the visual quality difference is barely noticeable. For those on more constrained systems, I dropped to the medium setting. Here you'll pick up 6% to performance compared to ultra. Low does give a sizable boost to 1% low performance, but considering the quality drop and the lack of an improvement to average frame rates, it's not a setting I'd recommend. Texture quality is a straightforward setting in most games, and that's no exception with Hitman 2. The texture work in this game is excellent across most elements, especially at 4K, and with the high setting, you're getting the sharpest textures at this resolution. Dropping to normal only provides a small loss in texture clarity, most noticeable on ground textures, and I suspect the difference would be hard to spot when playing on a 1080p display. Low basically blurs out all textures and looks like garbage. It's not a setting I'd recommend for most gamers. In terms of performance, I'd recommend keeping textures on high unless you're playing with a VRAM constrained card at higher resolutions. There simply isn't much of a performance hit switching to medium. Considering low only provides a 2% jump to performance for a massive loss in quality on a non-VRAM restricted GPU, again, I wouldn't bother with it. Texture filtering has a noticeable impact to the clarity of textures, so if you're using the high texture setting, you'll want to use the maximum 16 times anisotropic mode here. Anisotropic mode 16x through to 4x only have very small, almost imperceptible changes to clarity. It's only when you drop to 2x that quality begins to fall away noticeably. Then using the basic trilinear mode, well, that significantly hurts texture quality, so I wouldn't recommend using it unless you're also using low textures, which means you're probably on a seriously low-end system. Like with anisotropic filtering in most games, the performance impact across the top 3 modes is basically 0, except for some gains to 1% low performance. If you're experiencing unpleasant stuttering in some areas, I'd consider lowering the setting to 4x, but for most users, 16x makes the most sense. Only if you have an entry-level card should you experiment with 2 times anisotropic filtering, and maybe even trilinear filtering depending on the performance you're getting. SSAO, or Screen Space Ambient Occlusion, is the setting that has the largest performance impact in the game. There's only 2 settings, on or off, and it seems that the Glacier engine uses a fairly taxing implementation of this technology. The effect certainly looks good, it delivers self-shadowing across most elements in the game world, and that provides depth and realism, but it's not an enormous change to the lighting system, certainly not on the same level as regular shadow quality. When you look at the performance impact, it's pretty clear that those on performance-constrained systems should disable SSAO as the first port of call to gain around 12% to average frame rates and nearly 20% to 1% low performance. Yeah, the game will look worse, and if you're already achieving 60 FPS with SSAO enabled, I'd still leave it enabled, but for mid-range gamers who aren't quite hitting 60 FPS, this single setting might tip you over the edge for a noticeable but not significant hit to visuals. I am a little curious as to what this engine is doing with SSAO that delivers such a huge performance hit when enabled. It is one of the higher cost effects in most games, but a typical performance improvement from disabling the effect is around the 5% mark, sometimes up to 10%. Maybe a revision to the game engine could improve this a little bit in Hitman 2. Shadow quality affects shadow resolution primarily. The ultra setting has the sharpest shadows, high is still pretty good, medium is where you start to see a loss in sharpness, and the low setting significantly blurs and pixelates the edges of shadows. This shadow resolution quality applies to both near and far shadows. While Hitman 2 does drop shadow quality for further away shadows, Ultra still delivers higher resolution of far shadows than medium, for example, but it doesn't extend the distance to which you get the highest quality near shadows. This is especially noticeable when looking at crowd shadows. Each member of the crowd only gets an individual shadow when you're close to them. If you step back maybe 10 meters, those shadows disappear entirely. So one of the performance improving tricks the game implements is to use no far shadows for crowd members. However, the point at which these shadows pop in is going to be identical for the ultra and low shadow modes. In terms of performance, there's not much difference between ultra and high, and then there's also not much difference between medium and low, but you will get a 2% improvement to performance from switching from ultra down to medium. For most gamers, I'd recommend sticking with ultra. Only on entry-level systems is it worth dropping down to medium to get that small performance improvement. The final and most recently introduced setting is simulation quality, and this is the only setting that requires a full restart of the game to change. IO Interactive says this setting improves the amount and fidelity of crowds, cloth, destruction, and particle systems depending on your CPU. They recommend using the base mode on quad-core CPUs, the better mode on 6-core CPUs, and the best mode if you have 8 cores. Despite this advice, the game runs fine on the 6-core 8700K with the best mode. I actually found it quite hard to distinguish between all 3 modes in most areas of the maps where this quality setting is set to have an impact. Crowd density is one of the most striking elements to Hitman 2, but luckily even on the base mode, you're still going to be getting great crowd density. But there are some areas where elements are removed on settings below best. For example, here you see a section of simulated flags removed using the better mode compared to best, and then even more flags are removed on the base mode. It does depend on the area, but best has the highest density game world. In terms of performance, you won't see a big impact to average frame rates between the 3 modes. However, 1% low performance, which in this game is more CPU dependent, does improve by up to 10% moving from best to base. If you are struggling with FPS drops in crowd dense areas, or you have a lower end CPU, it might be best experimenting with the base mode just to drop the density of some world areas. So all up, there's not a lot of recommendations to make here purely because there aren't a lot of settings in Hitman 2. My advice for most gamers, considering the performance using ultra settings, is just to stick to the highest settings. If you want a bit more performance, the first thing I'd change is turning off SSAO. After that, shifting level of detail down to high or medium would be advised. I'd only mess around with texture quality, texture filtering, and shadow quality on entry-level systems struggling for performance. Similarly, CPU-bound gamers might find a bit of relief with the base simulation quality setting. The good news is the ultra settings themselves are for the most part well optimized, so if you have a mid-range system, you'll likely be playing at least at 1080p 60 FPS on average. For a game with great graphics like this, that's a good result. None of the settings deliver stupid performance penalties for no uplift in graphical quality. Everything is well balanced, though I guess perhaps I would like a less taxing SSAO implementation if that's possible. But at the same time, there's very little scope for improving frame rates on lower end hardware. When switching from everything on the high settings to everything on the lower settings, we only saw a 26% improvement to average frame rates and a 31% improvement to 1% lows. On entry-level hardware, you'll see up to an additional 10% at best, so maybe up to around the 35% improvement mark going from maximum to minimum quality. This puts Hitman 2 in an interesting position. It's one of those games where if you can run it, you're probably going to be running it pretty well. As we've mentioned before, 1080p 60 FPS on something like an R9 390 using ultra settings is about right. But if you're not getting good performance, it's unlikely you'll be able to do much about it. Take the GTX 1050 2GB for example, which is hovering around 30 FPS using ultra settings at 1080p. There's not much you can do to make this game close to a 60 FPS experience. Chuck everything to low, and in a best case scenario, you're looking at a frame rate in the low 40s. Other games like Battlefield 5, for example, provide almost double the performance gain that Hitman 2 does when comparing the minimum quality settings to ultra. This brings lower end or older cards into play in a way that Hitman 2 doesn't. Battlefield 5 also delivers great visual quality using the Ultra preset, and it's well optimized at the high end, but unlike Hitman 2, it also scales down well thanks to its larger range of quality options. With Hitman 2's narrow scope for performance scaling, it makes it hard to call the game well optimized overall. It's really only well optimized if you have decent GPU resources to begin with. It's not an Assassin's Creed Odyssey type situation for those with newer systems. It actually runs pretty well, but if your hardware isn't as new or isn't as high end, Hitman 2 could be a punishing game to run. Before closing this one out, I want to make special mention of the reflections in this game. Hitman 2 manages to use real reflections for many of its surfaces, including shiny floors and mirrors, without needing to use ray tracing. This scene here, for example, runs at 60 FPS at 4K on an RTX 2080, yet the floor is a true reflection, not a screen space reflection. Mirrors as well are true reflections, and there's some cool gameplay mechanics in the game that make use of that fact. Had Hitman 2 gone down the DXR or RTX path for reflections, I absolutely would not be able to play the game at 4K on an RTX 2080. So it just goes to show that you don't really need ray tracing for reflections in some games. That's it for this one. I'm actually really excited to play Hitman 2 because the first one was awesome, and this newer version seems to have even more crazy mechanics to play with. It's disappointing to hear the game doesn't seem to be selling well, but hopefully over time people will come and play this because it certainly is a lot of fun. Subscribe for more game optimization videos like this. Fallout 76 is up next, the one I've been dreading for a few weeks now. Consider supporting us on Patreon to get access to our exclusive Discord chat and monthly live streams, and I'll catch you in the next one.